The next paper is Finley I Lawson. I'm not sure if I pronounce your name correctly. Yes. It's okay. He's from Canterbury Christ Church University from United Kingdom, and his paper is a naturalist theology, Christianity within a holistic paradigm.
Thank you very much. It's always one of those challenging slots of the conference, isn't it, where you get to the end and everyone's kind of said everything that you were planning on saying. But I am going to try and stick to what I have planned and not respond to all the thoughts that I now have, having been here for 24 hours. So, I mean, the basic premise of what I want to say is that this conversation around sort of naturalism versus anti-naturalism I think is somewhat of a false dichotomy. I think it assumes that only the physical, however you want to interpret that, I'm aware that's potentially a contentious term, falls within the remit of science, that there is no space for anything other than the physical, and also that science provides a complete and full account of the world. And I think this is wrong. I think it's a misperception of what science is, and I'm going to look at two scientific accounts that very much have room for the immaterial in some sense. The caveat is they're both scientists and they both stop before they describe what the immaterial is. So they merrily point to it and say it's very important and we shouldn't forget it, but they're not going to discuss what that actually looks like. So, you know, it's a kind of a bit of a sort of hypothetical as to what it might look like as far as they're concerned. So just a kind of couple of naturalisms, really. I was at another conference a couple of weeks ago, and Fiona Ellis was talking about sort of some different kinds of naturalism. And I suppose the one that really sticks to mind as the traditional account is this scientistic naturalism, which is what I had up on the board at the beginning, where science provides a full account of what exists, but the minute you do this, the supernatural then starts to include things like aesthetics, morality, and things that I don't think most of us would want to consider as being supernatural in the traditional sense. So Ellis argues for what she terms an expansive naturalism. So she says that these things should be included, but I think where it becomes slightly problematic is she talks about that the transcendent does exist, but it's revealed in and through the natural. So it's still kind of having the transcendent as something separate to the material world or the worlds that it explains by science. And this stands in contrast to Paul Tillich's ecstatic naturalism, which is that there isn't a supernatural world out there. So Ellis has a supernatural world out there that is being described through the natural world. And Tillich argues that actually we're talking about self-transcendence. My argument falls in none of those categories. So rather, I'm probably oddly slightly more a scientistic naturalist, but I want to challenge what we mean when what we've got coming under that category of what is natural. And to do that, I'm going to look at two scholars, Hans Primus and Michael Asfeld, who both posit a holistic account of the world. They both argue from quantum mechanics that they say points to a fundamental and quite radical holism, but I think you can hold their ontology without necessarily adopting a particular interpretation of quantum mechanics. I think you can hold their ontology without being a realist about quantum mechanics, potentially. Both Esveld and Primus are interpretation neutral on their account of quantum mechanics as well. So Primus rejects more than Esveld does, but he rejects it for philosophical reasons. So I think there's scope here for a kind of meaningful conversation between the two. So Michael Esveld adopts a form of structural realism, but his holism really focuses on this idea of the sum being more than the parts. And what he means by that is that if you think of a normal, you could say that a heap of sand is more than the sum of its parts, right? The heap of sand is different to those grains of sand run out in a single line. Yeah, you're with me? So if I've got a heap of sand, the same grades of sand in a line of sand are two different things I'm discussing. However, Esveld argues that does not make the heap of sand a holistic system, because there isn't something in the nature of what it is to be a grain of sand that means it has to be part of that system. So for Esveld, this holism is really intrinsic, and it is really at the heart of what the world is. And he says that the world that we are part of is a holistic system. So we cannot understand the parts at all without understanding the whole. So he adopts this radical relational ontology. Now, he doesn't go as far as people like Ladyman and Ross do, but I think he doesn't go as far because of his scientific commitment. If you read his work, it feels like he stopped short of taking it to its conclusion. So within this holism, he argues that there are many concrete objects, but only one is fundamental. So there is this fundamental something, and we'll get to what that something might be, which again is immaterial but slightly ill-defined. He argues for what he terms a holistic atomism, which might sound slightly paradoxical, but what he actually means is that he's allowing there to be individual objects in the world. So individuals exist. How you define those individuals may be a separate matter, but individual things exist. So he is a thing ontology. However, unlike many others, he says that one of the problems we have is that the minute we get relational, we start to have this question about there being relations and the things that stand in relations, so the relator, and he says that we cannot treat those relator as independently existing things. So the relator and the relations are mutually ontologically independent. They both arise at the same time, and you cannot have one without the other. So it's fundamentally relational. However, this is sort of a conceptual underpinning, and what he argues is that there are these matter points, for want of a better word, but he doesn't mean matter in a traditional sense. And it appears that he's pointing towards more of an informational ontology. So for Esveld, there is this immaterial, or at least non-traditionally physical stuff that makes up reality. And fundamentally, what we can say about ontology is it is relational. So we just stop trying to point to what is the natural stuff of the world and start talking about what are those relations, and that is the underpinning ground. So therefore, when we get to these distinctions between what is natural and what is supernatural, what kinds of objects we might consider as being beyond the realm of science, these distinctions are conceptual. So we're talking about properties being the ways in which things exist rather than things that objects have. So that relationality is at the heart of everything, which is why I touched on with Heidegger in that question of being. However, these relations, and as I said, these relations and the things that are standing in them are codependent. And we end up in this situation, and I've got a quote from Esveld and Lamb there. So the removal of relations, if we take those relations out, leads to no thing being left in existence. So the objects don't have independent existence outside of the structure they are part of. So if we're applying this to what is within the realm of science and things we might traditionally consider as supernatural or where divinity might be located, actually if we have a more relational conception of divinity, then potentially that falls into this relational understanding of the structure of the world. So this just kind of recaps really that basically there is something foundational, there is something fundamental, but it is relational. And I argue elsewhere that there's a potential that this is an informational account of reality, potentially. Esveld doesn't go that far, but I think the two could be held together. But actually that there is this unbroken wholeness. The parts manifest from the whole, but the fundamental reality is beyond what can be understood by science. And this is kind of where Nadeau and Cavatos come in, but it's also where Esveld sits. And I would argue it's where we have to recognise that the world that science is exploring doesn't encapsulate the totality of what there is. And therefore, if we challenge naturalism, I think what exists beyond the world that can be investigated by science, we should still consider natural. It is of the natural world. We do not have access to it. So I don't think it's supernatural. The other account is Hans Primas, and he takes a slightly different approach. He argues that there are no things fundamentally. So whereas Esveld allowed there to be parts and parts to be a genuine part of reality, Primus just says we're wrong. We're deeply, fundamentally wrong when we think we can partition the world into things. And we're wrong if we think that we can, our conception of the world being made up of blocks of building stuff that can be investigated by science is wrong. That isn't to say that it's not methodologically helpful, that there isn't a contextualization that we go through to make sense of the world, but it isn't, we're mistaken in thinking it's ontological. And he makes a really clear distinction between what he calls endophysics and what he calls exophysics. And there's kind of a link to Kant's noumenal phenomenal in this as well. Primus doesn't make that link, but I think if you understand the concepts, they do. So endophysics is this hypothetical subject or observer independent account of reality. So it's what is the world like apart from our introspection of it, our understanding of it. And this, he argues, we can only really access via introspection, that it points, and he really emphasizes that it points to a Platonic type realm. So he really eggs the immaterial form world. For Primus, that's really important. He does make a distinction between that. He is writing from a scientific perspective and therefore cannot discuss it because it is a scientific writing. So he makes what we would term a traditional, naturalism beyond naturalism divide, but he says it is very much there. So that's why I think Primus is quite interesting from a philosophy of religion point of view. In contrast to the endophysics, there is the exophysics, which is the world of physics, right? And this is actually only gives us descriptions of what we expect to observe, and so it's a functional account. It's not an ontological account. And again, we're wrong if we think that's ontology, and in it being contextual, there is no one contextualization that is more right than the other. So that contextualization is down to us, which comes to the final bit, in which that we choose what is relevant and what is irrelevant, and we choose where to draw those lines. And whilst that's helpful, and it's, we wouldn't progress science without it, it's not ontological. So actually, there is this constant overlapping of where definitions fall. And this is kind of part of this. There is no individual objects. So it is a deeper relationality in that sense, or a kind of deeper holism. And so he is sitting against Esveld's account that allows atomism, allows there to be individual things, but also that he says that the whole isn't made up of parts. That's his real difference. So Esveld, the sum is more than its parts. For Primus, there are no parts. Okay, we make the parts. And there's a brilliant quote there from him where he says, "Objects do not yet exist, we have to create them." And our assumption that the world is not made, and we're incorrect, that the world is not made out of some building blocks. These are just manifestations of the material reality. So if we think they're real, we're wrong. So he argues that, to be sure, an ontic interpretation of quantum mechanics does refer to a fictitious, theoretical, immanent reality and not the ultimate reality, this underpinning that we cannot access. And we are a lot closer to Plato's ideas, according to which the attempt to divide matter again and again results in mathematical forms. It doesn't result in more real stuff at the bottom. and in another paper he argues that our distinctions between atemporal material and atemporal mental and the temporal domain do not imply ontological partition. We choose that partition, we break that down in the way that we try to examine the world in order to facilitate our conversation. So what does this mean for naturalism? I think it means that there is possibility to have a transcendent naturalist approach to the world. I think Primus and Esveld are really interesting in the ontologies that they present. I think it's incredibly challenging. I don't think they solve the problem, really, of I think they solve the challenge of naturalism versus anti-naturalism, because I'd argue that we need to expand what we mean by natural, and both allow us to do that in a scientifically informed way. They are both scientists. I think from a philosophy of religion or a theology point of view, it raises a whole host of other questions that we then need to start grappling with about relationships between humanity and divinity, about how we draw those boundaries, if they actually exist. Do we end up in a situation where actually divinity is a question of difference of sort of isn't a difference of kind, but is a difference of degree? I don't know. Potentially we have to end up in a panentheistic account of the world as well, particularly if we follow Primus. But I think what is really crucial is both point to an immaterial, and they both are really clear that it exists, that it isn't, whilst it's beyond the reach of science, it isn't beyond what is natural. And I think that's the distinction I really want to make. Just because we cannot access it with science doesn't mean that it is supernatural. And they both stop short of exploring what that might actually look like. Primus explicitly, because he is writing on science, and he says that repeatedly throughout his work. Esveld, I think, because he doesn't want to take it to the conclusion that he will end up in, and I don't think he wants to adopt strong ontic realism. I think that's where his argument ends up, in a strong structural realism account. So yeah, they're my thoughts, my scientific accounts of where we might go with naturalism. I think naturalism I think we can have a theistic naturalism within a holistic scientific account of the world. A couple of references, and I can share this with people afterwards, should you wish to. And any questions?